Greetings, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we're going to do a review of chapter 4 of the autobiography of Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery, Inshallah. Chapter 4, he talks a lot about the school Hampton Institute, which is currently Hampton University. It's where I'm from, so I like this chapter. Chapter 4, title of chapter 4 is Helping Others. So after Booker's first year at Hampton, other students were going home for vacation, but Booker didn't have any money to go home or anywhere, but he still had to go somewhere. Booker somehow was able to get his hands on an old coat, and he got the idea to sell the coat for money. Being prideful, Booker didn't want the other students to know that he didn't have any money, but Booker was only able to sell the coat for 5 cents. Eventually, all the students and teachers left Hampton, and this made Booker depressed. After trying to find a job in Hampton for several days, Booker was able to get a job at a restaurant at Fortress Monroe. We call it Fort Monroe now, but main Fortress Fort. After Booker's first year of school, he owed $16 in tuition that he wasn't able to pay, that he wasn't able to work off. Booker wanted to save money over the summer to pay off the debt. He considered this a, quote, debt of honor, end quote. Booker saved as much as he could, but he was still short of the $16 at the end of the summer. One day, on his last week in the restaurant, Booker found a $10 bill under one of the tables. Being a respectable individual, Booker shared this information with the owner of the restaurant, and the owner kept the money for himself. But Booker writes, quote, "This, I confess, was another pretty hard blow to me. I will not say that I became discouraged, for as I now look back over my life, I do not recall that I ever became discouraged over anything that I set out to accomplish," end quote. He continues, quote, "I never had much patience with the multitudes of people who are always ready to explain why one cannot succeed," end quote. At the end, I guess it's the end of the summer, Booker ended up speaking with the treasurer of Hampton Institute, General J.F.B. Marshall, and the treasurer allowed Booker to continue his studies with the promise of paying back the debt ASAP. Booker felt that the textbook knowledge he received from Hampton was only a small part of his education. In his second year at Hampton, Booker began to become aware of the unselfishness of the teachers. He didn't understand how anybody could be so happy working for others. Booker writes, quote, "I began learning that those who are the happiest are those who do the most for others," end quote. Booker felt that the most valuable thing that he got out of his second year was, quote, "an understanding of the use and value of the Bible," end quote. He was taught by Miss Natalie Ford from Portland, Maine. Booker writes, quote, "The lessons taught me in this respect took such a hold upon me that at the present time, when I am at home, no matter how busy I am, I always make it a rule to read a chapter or a portion of a chapter in the morning before the beginning of the workday," end quote. Booker owed his ability as a public speaker in some way to Miss Lord. She gave him private lessons on breathing, emphasis, and articulation. Although Booker was not attracted to public speaking, Booker writes, quote, "I consider that there is nothing so empty and unsatisfactory as mere abstract public speaking. But from my early childhood, I've had a desire to do something to make the world better, and then be able to speak to the world about that thing," end quote. Booker enjoyed the debating societies at Hampton held on Saturday evening and never missed a meeting. He even helped to build a separate debate group for daily debates. At the end of the second year at Hampton, Booker was able to return home, which was in Malden, West Virginia. When he got back to Malden, Booker says that the salt furnace and the coal mine were not running because the workers were on strike. Booker says that while on strike, workers would spend everything that they saved and eventually come back to work at the same or lower wages than they had before. Booker writes, quote, "My observations convinced me that the miners were worse off at the end of the strike," end quote. Booker's mother and his family were happy to see him and observed his improvements over the last 2 years. Booker writes, quote, "The rejoicing on the part of all classes of colored people, and especially the older ones, over my return was almost pathetic," end quote. Booker had to visit and have a meal with each family and tell them about life at Hampton. Booker just wanted to find work so he can start making money, but he couldn't find work due to the strike. Booker writes, quote, "I spent nearly the whole of the first month of my vacation in an effort to find something to do by which I could earn money to pay my way back to Hampton and save a little money to use after reaching there." End quote. Toward the end of the first month, while Booker was traveling to find work, his brother John found him at 3 a.m., resting in an abandoned house. I think it was kind of amazing that his brother just found him in the middle of an abandoned house, you know, at 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't know how that happened, but, you know. He found Booker to let him know that that their mother had died during the night. Booker writes, quote, "This seemed to me the saddest and blankest moment in my life," end quote. Booker writes, quote, "One of the chief ambitions which spurred me on at Hampton was that I might be able to get into a position in which I could better make my mother comfortable and happy," end quote. Booker's mother always wanted to see her children educated and started out in the world. It was hard for Booker's family to maintain the home after his mother passed. His sister Amanda was too young, and his stepfather wasn't able to hire a housekeeper. Sometimes they would have a can of tomatoes and crackers as a meal. Every part of the house was falling apart, and Booker recalls this as, quote, "the most dismal period of my life," end quote. Mrs. Ruffner helped Booker during this time of his life, so during the time of the loss of his mother. Booker was able to make enough money just to get back to Hampton, but he knew that with his skills as a janitor, he would be able to work his way through the school year. Booker was invited back to Hampton 2 weeks before school reopened. He was invited by Miss Mary Mackey, the lady principal. She wanted Booker's help cleaning the buildings and preparing for the new school year. Miss Mackey was, quote, "a member of the oldest and most cultured families of the North," end quote. She worked side by side with Booker cleaning the school for 2 weeks, and this was something that Miss Mackey did every year. Booker didn't understand how a woman with access to privilege could be happy doing services to assist the uplift of another race. Ever since then, Booker says, quote, "I have had no patience with any school for my race in the South which did not teach its students the dignity of labor," end quote. During Booker's last year at Hampton, he would occupy any free time with studying. Booker writes, quote, "I was determined, if possible, to make such a record in my class as would cause me to be placed on the honor roll," end quote. And he succeeded in doing this. It was June 1875. I estimate Booker to be about 26, 27 years old at this time. So June 1875, Booker finished his regular course of study at Hampton. When Booker thought about the benefits that he got from Hampton Institute, he says there were two things. First was his contact with a great man, General Samuel Armstrong, who Booker says was, quote, "the rarest, strongest, the most beautiful character that it has ever been my privilege to meet," end quote. And the second thing was, quote, "at Hampton, for the first time, I learned what an education was expected to do for an individual," end quote. He continues, quote, "At Hampton, I not only learned that it was not a disgrace to labor, but learned to love labor, not alone for its financial value, but for labor's own sake and for the independence and self-reliance which the ability to do something which the world wants done brings," end quote. Booker found that, quote, "the happiest individuals are those who do the most to make others useful and happy," end quote. Booker was completely out of money when he graduated from Hampton. Booker got a job as a waiter in Connecticut. Booker didn't know the skills required to be a waiter, and he was demoted from a waiter to a dish carrier. But Booker was determined to learn how to be a waiter, and within a few weeks, he was promoted back to being a waiter. At the end of the hotel season, Booker returned to his home in Malden. He was elected to teach at the local colored school. Booker says this made him feel, quote, "I had the opportunity to help the people of my hometown to a higher life," end quote. Booker taught from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. He felt his hometown needed more than just book education. He also taught how to comb your hair and keep your hands, feet, and clothes clean. He also writes, quote, "I have special attention to teaching them proper use I gave special attention to teaching them proper use of the toothbrush and the bath. End quote. Booker highly valued and stressed the importance of the toothbrush. Booker opened a night school for people that worked during the day but still wanted an education. Booker felt that some of the older students were quote-unquote pathetic in their efforts to learn. In addition to teaching, Booker established a reading room and debate society. He also taught 2 Sunday schools and gave private lessons to individuals that he saw fit to send to Hampton Institute. Booker taught anyone who wanted to learn without regard to pay. He writes, quote, "I was supremely happy in the opportunity of being able to assist somebody else," end quote. While Booker was at Hampton, his older brother John worked to support the family. He also had to neglect his own education during the time when he was working to support the family and Booker was off at school. His brother couldn't pursue education. To repay his brother, Booker worked to get his brother into Hampton. And his brother finished Hampton in 3 years and became the superintendent of industries at Tuskegee. Both of the older brothers, so Booker and his brother John, saved up to send their adopted brother James to Hampton. And James eventually became the postmaster at Tuskegee. 1877, and I estimate Booker to be about 28, 29 years old at this time. 1877 was Booker's second year teaching in Malden. And he says this was a repeat of the actions of the previous year. So working from 8 to 10, Sunday school, and private lessons for individuals he thought could go to Hampton. It was around this time, the late 1870s, that the Ku Klux Klan was in the height of its activity. Booker describes the Klan as, quote, "bands of men who had joined themselves together for the purpose of regulating the conduct of the colored people, especially with the object of preventing the members of the race from exercising any influence in politics," end quote. Booker compares the Klan to the patrollers in the forest that he mentions in chapter 1. The Klan worked at night, and Booker repeats, quote, "Their objects in the main were to crush out the political aspirations of the Negroes," end quote. Booker ends the chapter talking about the impression that the patrols and the Klan had upon him growing up in Malden. Booker writes, quote, "It seemed to me as I watched this struggle," so he's talking about a big fight between the races, between a group of blacks and a group of whites. I don't know if it was 100 or 200 people, I can't remember. But he said, "It seems to me as I watched this struggle between members of the two races that there was no hope for our people in this country," end quote. In closing, Booker highlights the changes in the South since the 1880s and so forth. At this time, Booker said that the Klan didn't exist and they had no organizations in the South. And there were few places that would allow organizations like the Klan to exist. But in 2019, that's a little bit different. And that is the end of chapter 14. Make sure you read the book, read the chapter for yourself. Share this information if you like what you heard. Comment on anything you disagree with or any questions you got. If you'd like to make a donation to Booker T. Washington and his legacy, I would recommend donating to www.tuskegee.edu. That's the school that he built. And other than that, thank you for coming through. Thank you for watching the video. Thank you for listening. And I'll see y'all in chapter 5, inshallah. And peace out. Ma'as salama. Assalamu alaikum. Peace, family.